Where does India stand amid the geopolitical tensions and the changing world order? From investment to trade. To talk more on this, I'm joined by Deepa Kumar, who is the head of Asia Pacific Country Risk at S&P Global. Thank you for joining us, Deepa.
Thank you for having me.
Deepa, I want to start by asking you that, the global supply chains are realigning and there is a lot of volatility, geopolitical tensions going on. How is India positioned to take benefit of the new trade opportunities?
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing is India is trying to increase its integration in the global economy at a time of, like you were saying, there's a bit more thought given to how supply chains are structured and to conditional globalization, which is different from, say, how some peers in APAC grew, South Korea and Japan. The world was a bit more unbridled on globalization then. I think what India brings to the table is these kind of new arrangements that India is willing to offer some of these countries when it comes to what are the advantages that you can find in India domestically. Labor supply is abundant in India, young and also regionally competitive. That is something which is unique to India at a time when the rest of the world is getting older and like labor forces are slowing down there. So that is one thing. The second thing is aligning it with political trust. And I know we're going to talk about geopolitics a bit more, but it's also in the framework of India's strategy of strategic autonomy, which is that, you're not just doing trade with a country that is giving you trade advantages, but you're increasing your trade linkages with a country that you can trust, a country where, some of these geopolitical headwinds may not play out as strongly. And that has become a bigger factor in trade and supply chain globally because everybody is not just looking at the most cost competitive way to do it, but also the more sort of geopolitical proof way of doing trade and supply chain. So that is another argument that we're seeing come from the Indian side to partners abroad as to what should be the reason for integrating India more deeply.
So coming on to geopolitical risks, what are the major risks which India has to watch out for in the next 3 to 5 years, and how will that shape our economic strategy or trajectory going ahead?
I think how we think of the Indian geopolitical landscape, and I use this in a couple of reports, is this concentric circles approach. So if you keep India at the middle of the circle and then if you start building circles around it, the first question is the Indian neighborhood. And then you move to emerging economies in other parts of the world. And the third is, of course, then the advanced economies as well. What India needs to, and I wouldn't necessarily call them risks. I call them more as indicators to watch for because they could play out anyway, right? Like they could be a risk, but they could also absolutely be an opportunity for India to galvanize. So an indicator to watch for is one is how does India manage its participation in the neighborhood? How does it work with the changing sort of political order in the neighborhood? Second, what is the role that India seeks for itself and builds with some of these emerging economies as they are growing and they are facing their own domestic challenges and opportunities? So is there a role for India to play to help stabilize their economies? Is there a role for India to play to train their labor forces? And is there a role for India to play? Actually, this is an interesting one, is exporting regulatory frameworks. Because one of the things we see with a lot of these countries is how do you adapt to new technologies? How do you adapt to new sectors? So coming back to the question, tying it all up is these are risks, but these could also be opportunities. India is surrounded by countries in its neighborhood and extended neighborhood whose future trajectories are going to influence sort of India's economic policies, India's trade policies, and how India interacts with these countries. So depending on how well that strategy comes to play, could be a risk, could also be an opportunity.
Also the fact that India is signing free trade agreements with a lot of countries, and it also has emphasis on the Atmanirbhar Bharat. So how will this dual approach sort of play out in terms of the growth of the country?
I think, the dual approach a lot of the times is considered to be contradictory. I would say it's actually complementary. So the way some of these FTA negotiations are getting designed, and of course what we have access to in the public domain and what we see, is that embedding some of these domestic industries and embedding them in the way that you actually spur domestic manufacturing, you support domestic employment, is absolutely the north star of these FTA negotiations.
How will it play out in the energy transition and the technology sector as well?
The FTA specifically?
The whole bit of balancing both the dual approaches which India has.
Again, I think energy security and energy transition, and I have colleagues who speak to it much more educated than I do, but they both are here to stay. In fact, there are three things. It's not just security, it's security, transition, and affordability. all three are important from India, and especially from what I've learned from my colleagues, you're not going to see them pick one or sort of give it the other. But a good way to think of it is like in India, energy transition is also energy security. You are a climate vulnerable country. We have seen, the monsoons this year as a small indicator of what sometimes climate volatility can do to India. So as much as you do what is considered to be energy security in terms of fossil fuels or in terms of energy dependence elsewhere, you do need to bring in the transition story a lot more, because that is actually going to lead to the energy security or securing your energy supplies in the future piece as well. And in India's case, you have to do it in an affordable way.
Now, I mean, India is projecting itself as the leader of the global south, as the voice of the global south, rather. So, how do you think that will affect our, agreements with the developed countries, developed economies, and overall?
So, the interesting framework for that and something that we speak about is we think of India as a bridge country. So, at a time when, there are different frameworks being applied, different objectives that advanced economies, emerging economies, frontier economies are chasing, we think actually more than just being a leader of the quote unquote global south, India is likely to play that role of a bridge. India works with the advanced economies. In the noise of a lot of political relationships, one of India's main strategic partner that doesn't get called out enough is actually Japan. And it's very much a G7 economy, very much an advanced economy. And how its role of working with the advanced economies influences some of the sort of lessons learned and some of the representation that it can do for the emerging economies. So I wouldn't say India is going to pick one camp of either the advanced economies or the quote unquote global south. They are very likely to want to play the role of BRICS, role of a bridge economy. Yeah. And the reason I said BRICS is because I was going to say that it shows in the multilateral forums that are important to India. BRICS is important, but G20 is also important. COP is important, and at the same time Quad is also important. So all the kind of foreign policy levers that we see getting pulled suggest to us that it's that middle sort of facilitator role on the global stage that India wants to play most.
Absolutely. When it comes to risk profiling, how does India stand compared to the emerging markets like Vietnam or Brazil and Indonesia?
In the current environment, of course, we are still to watch out for how some of the tariff negotiations play out. What we know from at least the framework agreements that are there are different tariff arrangements that are there with the ASEAN countries, anywhere between 15 to 19%. So assuming even if India is at 25%, that shifts regional competitiveness a bit away from India. But again, the question is it a short-term risk or is it a medium-term risk? If it is a short-term risk, then eventually it should all sort of start stabilizing, and then it depends on what is the rate India lands with. But one thing which is there, and it's here to stay, and which I started with, is the regional competitiveness of India's labor. That agnostic of the tariffs, India has more competitive labor than some of these players that we have in Southeast Asia. So it depends really on how some policy tools make sure that you can take advantage of this. It's young, it's abundant, but it's also underutilized and underskilled. So it's how do you bring them into the workforce more, and how do you give them the right skilling to contribute most effectively to the economy?
Lastly, my question on domestic policy. What sort of approach will be necessary for India to stay resilient when the world order is changing?
So I think we've already started seeing, the messaging suggesting that now is the moment for more economic reforms, more structural regulatory reforms. If the intent is matched by action, then it is absolutely the path to go on. The one thing that we particularly like to highlight is how does this also translate at the state level? So yes, we are looking at a lot of the central government policies, and they're exceedingly important, but they also need to be aligned, even if not uniform, right? Like there are different ways in which states operate, but how do they translate to different states, and what is the kind of alignment in those frameworks that we can find? So I would say the starting point is these economic reforms that are happening at the central level that we've been told are happening. But the next step is how do you sort of have a downstream effect of that? Is how do they start playing out at the state level? What is the implementation timeline of that? How does competitive federalism come to pass? And then how does that affect some of these other objectives that we've spoken about?
Thank you so much for that insightful
Thank you
interview.
for having me.
Thank you.